Imagine turning your spare bedroom into like a multi-generational genetics lab.
Right, just completely taking over the house.
Exactly. You were working these grueling manual labor hours, managing hundreds of individual microhabitats and carefully logging genetic traits. And, you're doing it all entirely without pay.
Which is just wild when you really step back and look at it.
It really is. And then a global crisis hits and the entire operation inevitably collapses under its own weight. And you just sit back and realize, wait, this was supposed to be my relaxing hobby.
Yeah, it's the classic trap of taking something fun and going totally off the deep end with it.
Welcome to today's deep dive. Today, we are looking at how our passions silently mutate into second jobs, basically, and how we can occasionally rescue them from our own ambitions.
It is a super relevant topic for pretty much anyone who has ever started a project, with good intentions.
Definitely. And our source material for you today is this short but highly reflective personal journal entry. It's dated August 8, 2026, and it's titled Notes on Fishkeeping, Part 311, by an enthusiast named Ang.
It's a really brief piece of writing, but it acts as this remarkably clear mirror for anyone who has ever taken a passion project just a little too far.
Because on the surface, this source is just a literal update about keeping Betta fish.
Right, those vibrantly colored, long, thin fish you always see in specialized aquatic setups.
Yes, those exact ones.
Yeah.
But the mission of this deep dive is to explore the deeply relatable psychological architecture hidden beneath Ang's update. We are mapping out the anatomy of hobby burnout.
Which happens to so many of us.
Absolutely. We are examining how the ways we engage with our passions shift over a lifetime. And we're unpacking this profound transition from aggressively trying to control a natural system to simply sitting back and observing it.
It's a huge mindset shift.
Okay, let's unpack this. Where does the timeline of Ang's relationship with this hobby actually begin?
Well, to appreciate the philosophical shift Ang makes in 2026, we really have to examine the baseline of their past behavior.
Right. We need the context.
Exactly. The journal notes that Ang's journey with fish keeping began, as they put it, many moons ago, and they were operating at a level that most casual pet owners would find like entirely foreign.
We're not talking about a goldfish in a bowl here.
No, not at all. They were keeping and breeding betta fish on a massive scale. Specifically, they were trying to lock in very specific genetic traits over 2 to 3 generations.
Which means we are not talking about, just tossing some food flakes into a bowl before heading to the office.
That's far from it.
Because betta fish, particularly the males, are famously territorial. They will fight.
Oh, absolutely. They can't be housed together.
Right. So if you are breeding them at scale, you are managing a staggering amount of infrastructure. You have hundreds of separate jars for the males. You are changing the water constantly to maintain pristine chemistry.
You're cultivating live microscopic food for the fry.
Yeah. It is a literal industrial-scale undertaking happening inside a private home.
And that infrastructure brings an immense cognitive load. Like, Ang was essentially acting as a genetic architect, right? Trying to force a myological outcome.
I like trying to get a specific fin shape or something.
Exactly. Perhaps a specific fin structure, like a perfect half-moon tail, or a specific iridescent color wash. But the fish were just not cooperating.
Nature rarely does, right?
Right. The source highlights a really deep frustration with the inability to produce those desired genetic traits, despite the massive manual labor being poured into the system.
I have to stop you there because I read this and my immediate thought was, why do we do this to ourselves?
That is the million-dollar question.
I love baking bread, right? But the second I start weighing flour to the microgram, calculating the ambient humidity of my kitchen and logging it all in a spreadsheet,
It stops being fun.
I literally want to throw my oven out the window. It transforms a leisure activity into a high-stakes corporate merger. Why do we feel this compulsion to optimize our passions, like selectively breeding for highly specific traits, instead of just enjoying the simple act of keeping a fish or baking a loaf of bread?
What's really fascinating here is the underlying neurochemistry of how we learn and, experience reward.
Okay, so there's a biological reason for this.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah.
When you first adopt a hobby, the simple act of baseline competence, like just keeping a fish alive or baking an edible loaf of bread, it triggers a massive dopamine release.
It's that joy of discovery, like, hey, I did a thing.
Exactly. It's the thrill of the new. But the human brain is highly adaptable. It habituates to that baseline very quickly. Soon, just keeping the fish alive no longer triggers the reward system.
Oh, I see.
To get that same neurochemical payoff, the brain demands progression.
The bar for satisfaction gets raised automatically, so you are forced to seek out more complex challenges just to feel the same level of enjoyment.
Precisely. You transition from a casual participant into an optimizer.
Right.
You start chasing perfection because the brain equates optimization with mastery. But there's a huge trap here. In the pursuit of mastery, you build an incredibly rigid, labor-intensive system.
You're managing variables instead of just, enjoying an activity.
Right. And when you build a rigid system, it completely loses its ability to absorb shock.
That makes me think of running a high-performance sports car entirely in first gear.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Yeah, because the engine is doing an incredible amount of work, revving at maximum capacity, but because you are rigidly forcing it to stay in one mode, the friction eventually just burns out the transmission.
That captures the mechanics of burnout perfectly. The system is generating too much heat and not enough forward momentum.
Which is exactly what happened to Aang.
Right. For Aang, the friction of failed genetic outcomes combined with all that grueling manual labor was already overheating the engine. And then came the external shock.
The onset of the pandemic.
Exactly. The journal explicitly notes that this combination of internal frustration and external crisis forced Aang to completely halt the pursuit. The operation did not just slow down, it collapsed.
But you do not just erase that level of expertise overnight. Even after the pandemic settled and the breeding tanks were packed away, Aang still had that encyclopedic knowledge rattling around in their head.
Which is a heavy thing to carry when you're not using it.
Right. Which leads us to a fascinating in-between period in the journal. Over the intervening years, life started to normalize. Aang went on various field trips and actually encountered Betta fish out in the world.
The physical opportunity to jump back into the hobby was constantly presenting itself.
Yet they actively refused to re-engage. According to the text, Aang made a conscious choice to stay away. Why? Because the bettas available on the market during those years were of remarkably low quality, and they were being sold at highly inflated prices.
It was a terrible market for an enthusiast.
Wait, let's pause on that market dynamic, because that feels almost contradictory to the idea of passion. Well, if you truly love an animal, and you've been deprived of that hobby for years, shouldn't you just be happy to see the fish? Like, why let the price tag or the broader retail market trends dictate your personal enjoyment?
You'd think so, right?
Yeah. If you want a fish, just buy the fish and ignore the industry.
Well, this raises a really important question about how expertise permanently rewires our perception. In cognitive psychology, there is a concept known as the expert's curse.
The expert's curse, okay.
When you spend years deeply studying a subject like Aang did with multi-generational beta genetics, your brain builds these complex schemas. You do not just see a fish anymore. You instinctively process a massive checklist of structural data.
Oh, wow. So they're automatically scanning for, fin ray branching, spinal alignment, scale health, and genetic lineage without even trying to.
Exactly. And you cannot turn that scanner off. When a novice walks into a pet store and sees a high-priced betta, they just see a beautiful splash of red swimming in a cup.
Ignorance is bliss.
Truly. Because when a former large-scale breeder looks at that exact same fish, their highly developed schema immediately detects poor breeding practices, weak genetics, and a blatant cash grab.
It creates profound cognitive dissonance.
Right. It actually feels insulting to the craft they dedicated so much labor to.
It is the equivalent of a retired Michelin star chef walking into a roadside diner, being served a piece of burnt, unseasoned toast, and being handed a $50 bill for it.
Yes. Perfect analogy.
Like, that experience doesn't reignite a passion for cooking. It just makes you deeply annoyed at the current state of the restaurant industry. You would rather just not eat toast.
That hits the core of the issue. Aang's internal standards acting as a barrier wasn't a sign that they no longer loved fish keeping. It was a sign of respect for the hobby itself.
That makes a lot of sense.
Returning to a passion after a severe burnout requires a delicate alignment. The external conditions, the resources, the market, the environment, they all have to match your internal standards and your emotional bandwidth. You cannot force a comeback when the ecosystem isn't ready to support it.
And Aang practiced immense patience by not forcing it, which is a really powerful realization for anyone listening.
I think so too.
If you are feeling disconnected from something you used to love, it might not be a failure of passion. It might just be that your current environment or the current market simply does not warrant your participation yet. Waiting for the landscape to shift is a completely valid, active strategy.
because eventually the variables always change.
Which catapults us to the present day in the text, August 2026. The alignment finally happens. Two major catalysts spark Aang's return.
Right, the landscape shifts.
Exactly. First, the market corrects itself. Aang notes a recent availability of affordable, decent quality betta fish. Second, Aang decides to start a new outdoor pond on their backyard balcony.
A totally different setup.
Yes, and here's where it gets really interesting. Because Aang sets a very strict boundary for this return. The journal explicitly states they have zero intention of selectively breeding these new fish.
That boundary is, without a doubt, the most crucial data point in the entire journal entry.
They're only picking up a few pairs strictly to evaluate their suitability for this specific balcony microclimate. So instead of being the architect demanding a specific building be constructed, Aang is playing the role of a scout, just surveying the land to see what naturally wants to grow there.
Which requires far less energy.
Right. It feels like a high-stress corporate executive who used to manage thousands of employees across global divisions, finally retiring, and then taking a low-stress part-time consulting gig just for the intellectual fun of it.
He's just dipping a toe in.
Yeah. They still retain all the top-tier skills, but they are absolutely refusing to take on the associated stress.
The executive analogy highlights the fundamental change in how cognitive energy is being spent here. We are looking at a complete paradigm shift from a framework of control to a framework of observation.
And those two frameworks require completely different amounts of psychological fuel.
Oh, completely.
When Aang was in the control mindset, trying to manufacture specific genetic traits, they were actively battling nature. They had to suppress every biological variable that didn't align with their end goal.
Which is exhausting.
It requires immense continuous energy output. But this new observation mindset, evaluating a few pairs on a balcony, completely removes the heavy lifting. Aang is just asking a question like, will you thrive in this specific temperature and light? Rather than making a demand like you must genetically mutate to look exactly like this.
Right, and by removing the expectation of a manufactured product, Aang eliminates the possibility of failure.
Oh, that's true.
If the fish do not thrive on the balcony, it isn't a failure of Aang's genetic skills. It is simply a data point about the microclimate.
Just useful information.
Exactly. The hobby ceases to be a rigid industrial process and transforms into an open-ended ecological experiment. It conserves mental energy and allows curiosity to replace frustration.
It is incredibly liberating to read. You can practically feel the oxygen returning to the hobby. But, philosophy is easy in a journal. Reality is often much messier.
It always is.
It is one thing to declare you are taking a hands-off observational approach, but it is entirely another to stick to that when the environment starts acting up. And the balcony pond does indeed act up.
Because nature abhors a sterile environment.
It really does. Moving into the final aspect of Aang's update, we get a status report on how this new philosophy is holding up in practice. The text notes that the fish are currently thriving, but they are doing so amidst an active algae bloom in the pond water.
Which is a huge test for Aang. In the context of Aang's previous life, running those pristine, highly controlled breeding jars, an algae bloom would have been an absolute crisis.
Total nightmare.
It would have been viewed as a failure of maintenance, an invasive variable that required immediate, aggressive intervention.
You would be breaking out the chemical treatments, doing massive water changes, scrubbing the glass for hours just to restore the illusion of total control.
Endless work.
But Aang doesn't panic. Instead, Aang introduces a brilliant reframing. The journal states that their new primary focus is to simply treat the bettas as gardeners for the aquatic plants in the pond.
I love that phrase.
It's so good. Giving a highly territorial predator fish a quaint job description like a gardener completely changes the lens through which we view the situation.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Aang is actively leaning into the science of biological symbiosis.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Well, in the old control framework, the betta fish were isolated, delicate centerpieces.
Right.
They were kept separate from their environment, and it required Aang to act as the sole life support system.
Right. Aang was the filter, the feeder, and the janitor.
Exactly. But by treating them as gardeners, Aang recognizes that the fish are functional, integrated components of a closed-loop system. Let's look at the biology of what is actually happening on that balcony.
Yeah, let's break it down.
The fish produce ammonia as waste. Beneficial bacteria in the pond convert that ammonia into nitrites and then into nitrates. The aquatic plants, and yes, the algae bloom, They consume those nitrates as fertilizer to grow.
It's a whole cycle.
Meanwhile, the bettas navigate the root systems, eating micropests and insect larvae that might damage the plants.
So the algae bloom is not a flaw in the system.
Not at all.
It is the engine of the system. It is actively filtering the water and keeping the fish healthy.
Precisely. Aang is leveraging the natural nitrogen cycle instead of fighting it with manual labor and chemicals. The system is sustaining itself. Letting the fish thrive within this slightly messy natural dynamic represents a far more resilient way to engage with the natural world.
It doesn't have to be perfect.
No, a successful hobby does not have to look like a sterile, heavily engineered laboratory. It can look like a self-regulating, slightly wild ecosystem on a backyard balcony.
And embracing that wildness requires a total surrender of ego.
Ooh, yes, that's a great point.
Because when you are a high-level breeder, your ego gets deeply tangled up in the results. Every perfect fin or rare color pattern is a reflection of your own skill. You want to control the environment to prove your competence.
It becomes about you, not the fish.
Exactly. But when you become an observer of an ecosystem, your ego is removed from the equation. You set the stage, you introduce the elements, and you let nature take the wheel. The success belongs to the ecosystem, not to you.
Surrendering that ego is the ultimate antidote to the dopamine treadmill we discussed earlier.
Really? How so?
Well, burnout happens when our intense desire for control violently collides with the reality of our limitations. When you willingly relinquish that desire for control, you remove the friction entirely.
The engine finally gets to shift out of first gear.
Exactly.
It is a profound realization that maps beautifully onto almost any ambition, far beyond the realm of aquatic pets. So what does this all mean for you? Navigating your own complex interests.
It challenges us to audit our passions and identify where we are unnecessarily playing the role of the genetic architect, forcing outcomes that are just draining our reserves.
When we distill the core lessons from Aang's journey, we see that passions are not static monoliths, right? They have life cycles.
Very natural life cycles.
It is entirely natural to begin with pure curiosity, slowly slide into a phase of intense high-stress optimization, hit an insurmountable wall, and then experience total burnout. That trajectory is practically a rite of passage for ambitious people.
But the narrative doesn't have to end at burnout. That's the most crucial takeaway here, is the architecture of the comeback.
And that comeback rarely looks like the original passion.
Rarely.
It requires evolution. You can transition from a framework of high-stress control and endless manual labor into a framework of low-stress observation and ecological integration. Aang went from managing a demanding multi-generational breeding facility to simply watching some fish swim through an algae bloom on a balcony. And the journal reflects a much deeper sense of peace because of it.
It proves that the expert's curse does not have to be a permanent affliction.
That's a relief.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That highly tuned visual acuity can be repurposed. Instead of using it as a weapon to criticize imperfection, you can use it as a tool to deeply appreciate the intricate, resilient biology of a self-sustaining microclimate.
You don't owe your past self a continuation of their stress. You are allowed to take the heavy, over-optimized version of your hobby, strip away the parts that cause you anxiety, and only keep the elements that actually bring you joy.
Redefining your terms of engagement is a sign of mastery in itself.
It really is. So I want to leave you with a final thought to explore on your own today. Look at the landscape of your own life. If you stepped away from a passion project in the past because it simply became too heavy, maybe it was writing a novel or coding a side project or painting or even cultivating an overly ambitious vegetable garden, what would it look like to reintroduce that activity into your life today?
It's a great question to sit with.
Not as a breeder desperately trying to control every variable and force a flawless outcome, but as a gardener, simply tending to the ecosystem, conserving your energy, and quietly observing what naturally chooses to bloom.
Because the most sustainable ecosystems are often the ones we just stop trying to micromanage.
Sometimes you just have to let the garden grow a little wild. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We will catch you next time.